In this demonstration, we'll show you how to use the Throttler enterprise integration pattern in a camel route. To illustrate the Throttler pattern, we consider the following scenario. Company X enters into a service level agreement with a third-party web service provider. A part of the agreement stipulates that Company X can make web service invocations at a maximum rate of 4 invocations per second. But how can Company X ensure that this maximum rate is not exceeded, and thus avoid incurring extra charges? This is where the Throttler pattern comes in. Consider the initial scenario where Company X's web client makes invocations directly on the third-party web service. By interposing a camel route containing a throttler between the web client and the web service, you can ensure that the rate of invocation is throttled down to a specified maximum rate. Now, let's see how this works in practice. First, we start up a process that represents the third-party web service. Next, we start up a web client that invokes on the third-party web service. Notice how the client imposes an intermittent load on the web service. It rapidly makes 16 invocations and then pauses for 4 seconds. Although the average rate of invocation is just 4 per second, the peak load violates the service level agreement. Now we'll show you how to create a camel route that throttles the invocation rate to an acceptable level. Starting with a blank Fuse IDE project, create a new camel XML file under the meta-inf Spring directory. In the camel XML file dialog, set the file name to throttler.xml and click Finish. After resizing the route canvas, we can start adding the route elements. Start the route with an endpoint that acts as a proxy for the web service. In the URI property, specify the endpoint as a Jetty web server, which listens for HTTP messages on IP port 9001. Now, from the Control Flow menu, select Throttler and drag it onto the canvas. After connecting the Throttler to the first endpoint, configure the Throttler in the Properties pane. To specify the maximum rate, set the time period to 1000 milliseconds and the maximum requests per period to 4. Add the final endpoint, which is responsible for forwarding invocations to the real web service. After connecting the Throttler to the final endpoint, configure the endpoint in the Properties pane. In the URI property, configure the endpoint to connect to the HTTP address of the real web service. To make this endpoint work correctly, you must set the option Bridge Endpoint equals True. Just one thing before we can start up this route. We must edit the Maven POM file to make sure that all of the required dependencies are included. For this demonstration, we need 2 additional dependencies. The camel Jetty artifact, which provides the implementation of the Jetty endpoint, and the camel HTTP artifact, which provides the implementation of the HTTP endpoint. After saving and closing the POM file, we are ready to run the route. Right-click on the throttler.xml file and select Run as Local Camel Context. In the console window, we can see the camel router application starting up. Now, let's return to the web client and see what happens when we connect it to the camel route we just created. We restart the client, but this time we connect it to port 9001 instead of 9000. As you can see, the irregular load is smoothed out and the invocation rate is now restricted to 4 per second, in keeping with the service level agreement.